Hello, I'm the GrubStVlogger. You see, my sister has started a vlog. I've got the link for it down there. And watching her do that, I thought, well, I could do something a bit more like that. Usually I have to watch and research and read and write something. I thought, no, let's do something a bit more spontaneous, off the cuff, put away the silly hat and reveal the silly hair and see why I wear a hat. And I thought, yeah, let's be a bit natural. One of the things she's done was talk about what she read in July. And I thought, well, I've read some things in July. I can do that. So here goes. First book I read in July was Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a very anonymous looking copy. I picked it up for free years ago now. And, oh, that's not Cranford. Where's my copy of Cranford? Did I put it back? I thought I'd have done that. I really like the first little bit, which goes like this. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple come to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighbouring commercial town of Drumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. Well, that sounds interesting. Sort of women-run village, and I thought, yeah, and I finally got round to it. One of the things that I most enjoyed at the beginning was there were a lot of references to Samuel Johnson. The character who seems to be the main character at the beginning is a big fan of Samuel Johnson and says that he writes light fiction better than Dickens does. And so she quotes in very broad, big gestures bits of Rasselas to prove what a great light writer he is, which doesn't exactly convince everyone. So I like that. But then she dies, and I thought, well, where's it going now? And there are lots of little stories about the characters and about their strange sort of mini society within Cranford and all of the things that are important to them. And as it goes on, a character called Miss Matty sort of becomes the main character. And when she's introduced, she's a retiring, quiet, almost a doormat. And as it goes on, she finds herself a bit, but more importantly, the other characters discover what a great depth of warmth and honesty and generosity she has. And so by the end of the book, it's kind of celebrating the heroic qualities that are quiet and that can easily be ignored. And she is a figurehead of those. And so I really enjoyed this book. I thought it surprised me and it made me laugh, and it was very, very good. Apparently there were more Cranford stories knocking about, so I might give them a check out in the future. My second book of July was one of the big ones I wanted to get done. It was Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Bleak House. And despite its length, in some ways it's too short because it is so crammed with things, with plots, with characters, with sides, quests and little mazes, and it's just full of stuff is this book. If I was to give a reader a bit of a hint on a good way of reading it, it would be don't look at this as a novel. It's not a tight, tidy piece. It's more like a soap opera. It's got a whole range of plots and subplots, and they intersect and they weave an importance, and the characters weave an importance, sometimes more, sometimes less. And so, yeah, more like a soap opera. I think probably the best way of reading it would have been as the people themselves read it in instalments throughout. This was 18 months it came out through. Imagine writing that in 18 months. That man was a machine. The main-ish character is someone called Esther Summerson, and a lot of people don't like her because she narrates a big chunk of it, and she's very self-deprecating, and she is always surprised when people are nice to her, and she thinks she's stupid and selfish and horrible, and people find her a bit too much on the self-deprecating stakes. I personally found it quite winning in that it was her self-internalising all of the voices from her childhood who told her how stupid and things she was. and I actually found that quite touching. But there you go. It is, of course, a Dickens, so it has loads of characters. Some of them are really good. Oh, that wobble was me putting it down on another table. Blimey. Loads of brilliant characters. You've got silly ones like Mr. Guppy, who falls in love with Esther and makes a fool out of himself. You've got ones I really hate. There's this guy called Skimpole, Mr. Skimpole, and he claims to be pure and innocent and above worldly matters. And he uses that to manipulate everybody and to take their money, and he's completely immoral. He would say he's amoral because he's above those sorts of things because he's such a pure character, but no, he's immoral, he's horrible. And then you've got monsters like Mr. Crook, who is this sort of guardian of papers, even though he can't read. He's like a miser who can't spend the money, even if he wanted to. And there's Mr. Smallweed, who's this slimy sort of, his head on a bag of body, and he has to be shaken up all the time because he doesn't have any structural integrity, and he blackmails people and he's very unpleasant. There's Mr. Tulkinghorn, who his character is so matte, it doesn't reflect anything. It takes everything in, all the secrets, even all the light when he walks into a room, that even the reader and the narrator and no one knows what his secrets are and who he really is and why he does the things he does. It's never revealed. It's hinted at sometimes that maybe he doesn't like the aristocracy he works for, but you never actually find out because he gives nothing away. And yeah, I mean, it's cram full of brilliant characters, some wonderful settings, some brilliant descriptions. The very beginning starts off with this description of fog covering the whole of London, and it's so thick you could see you wouldn't be surprised to see a Megalosaurus walking up the Holborn Hill. Yeah, it's big. There's a lot of it. There was a time in the middle of it when I just wish I was reading something else, even though I was enjoying it, just for a change. But if you take it for what it is, a big soap opera, a box set essentially, then it's very, very entertaining, full of really interesting bits, and I recommend it. The theme of that, I would say, is discovery. Everyone has a secret that they're either trying to find out or trying to hide, and it's about how all the different characters learn little pieces of their puzzles, how they hold on to some pieces, the different methods they use depending on what kind of person they are, and what they suspect depending on what kind of character they are. There's this wife who thinks her husband has cheated on her, and so she does everything to find that out, but he hasn't been. He's been keeping a different secret for someone else. Yeah, so discovery. If there's anything to hold it together as a theme, that would probably be it. And I enjoyed that very much. The next book is a collection of stories called His Last Fire by Alix Nathan. I discovered this because I sometimes read the reviews in The Guardian, and Alix Nathan had turned a couple of the short stories from this collection into a novel, and the novel is about an unornamental hermit. He lives underground, he doesn't cut his nails, he doesn't talk to anyone, he's given books and a bath and food, and that's it, and he lives there, and he goes mad, I think, is probably what happens in the book. That's what happens in the short story. So I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. But the review of the novel said read the short story because it has everything from the novel in it already, so I thought I'll do that. All of the short stories are set at the end of the 18th century. It's a time of revolution, rebellion. Everybody has a copy of The Rights of Man. Like, almost every character has read it. I haven't read it, but they will have it. They will have it in their pocket. They will have it by their bedside. And a lot of the stories are linked, often quite subtly. So in there is sort of the makings of about 4 novels. They're all linked but chopped up in short stories and put in funny orders in the book. The author, Alix Nathan, she's written 2 novels now, both of which started as stories in this book. So yeah, I found it hard work, partly because of the slightly unclear way the stories linked up. So I was always aware that this might have something to do with one of the other stories, partly because of the order, so you don't get the sort of long through stories in the right order. You have to piece it all together, which is clever, but a bit frustrating, especially when, the way she writes, the first page usually only uses pronouns. So there's this character, they come in and it's he or she, and you're thinking, well, who are they? And in a 5-page story, if you spend the first page not knowing who the story is about, it does get quite wearing. So I think I will check her novels out at some point, because I did like what she did, and I really like the areas of history she went into and the way she used that for stories. And there's a lot of cleverness in there, but I just found it just hard work. I found it harder work than Bleak House. So yeah, there's that one. Following that, I decided to read some miscellaneous essays. If you've read my blog, you'll have seen I read something called Something New, which I picked up in an Oxfam. And this is Volume 2. And so reading Volume 2 of miscellaneous essays by a writer you've never heard of is quite an exciting experience. And I really enjoyed it. And a year later, I found on Gutenberg Press on my e-reader Volume 1. I thought, give that a go, that would be good. It wasn't as good as Volume 2, weirdly. Automathes, whose real name was Richard Griffiths, he comes across in the second volume as this playful, interested, exciting person talking about all these weird things. In the first book, he comes across a little bit like that boring man in a pub who corners you. And yeah, it was a bit... He talked about science and religion and having to go at science a great deal in Volume 1. It seems like he wrote all the things he really wanted to write in Volume 1 and then could play in Volume 2, and I much prefer him playing. However, there was some of his playfulness in Volume 1, and it wasn't awful, but if you're going to read either Something New, I recommend Volume 2. Strange. The next book I read, a bit rare for me, it came out in June and I read it in July. That's very strange. The Rapture by McGlasson. And that is a novel set in the Panacea Society, and those who read my blog will see that I've done a number of things about the Panacea Society. I visited their museum in Bedford, and I've read a couple of books about Joanna Southcott and Octavia. For those who don't know, the Panacea Society were a religious movement, order, who lived in Bedford in the sort of 1910s to 2011, the last one, but the heydays, 1910s, 20s and 30s in Bedford, and they bought a bunch of houses together and they knocked all the gardens, and they said that that garden in the middle was the Garden of Eden, and that their leader Octavia was the daughter of God, the way Jesus was the Son of God. And as Jesus suffered in the body to save the soul, she would suffer in the soul to save the body. And so it's called the Rapture. They didn't believe in the Rapture. They didn't think they'd all go up to heaven. They thought that heaven would come down to them, and they'd prepare a place by a process called overcoming, where they analyse their own niggles and sins. Also just sort of unsocial habits. There was a big thing about being polite and being easy to live with. And so there are loads of rules. You know, Jesus had do unto others as others do unto you. The Panacean Society had don't put one of the Panacean Society's commands was you can't use too many cherries in a cherry cake. Also another one about don't scrape your knife on the plate. And don't munch toast too loudly. So yeah, so this is set in that society, and it's the main character is Dilys, who's the daughter of the leader, Octavia. And she's grown up in this society who believe her mother is essentially God. And she's grown up in this very narrow way of being. And in the book, there's an invented character called Grace, and the two have a relationship. How physical it gets is pretty uncertain because Dilys is the narrator and she's sort of cracking up a bit, and it's all a little bit unreliable. But yeah, that's essentially the plot. And it's weird because as someone who's interested in Panacean Society, it's not very good. Like, there's lots of little bits wrong. For example, Joanna Southcott is called the seventh prophet of the visitation, not the second. And that makes quite a big difference. The timeline's all conflated, everything's squished together. But it also implies things like Octavia used to do weird breastfeeding ceremonies with her closest disciples, and that someone was murdered, and that there was this secret lesbian relationship. There was, in fact, a secret gay relationship, which is covered in the book as well. And so, as history, it's not great. But as a novel, it's really, really gripping. So I completely recommend it as a novel. Just take it with 2 big handfuls of salt when it comes to the actual history of the Panacean Society. But as a novel, go for it. One of the best ones I read in July. The next novel I read was called The End We Start From. I picked it because I really like the cover. They say never judge a book by its cover, but it is a beautiful cover. It's a very odd book. I'll just show you it. You can see it's very, very short paragraphs, very, very short sentences. It tells the story of a flood that floods all of London, and the main character of the book has just given birth, and she's on the run, and she's a refugee going further and further up north towards Scotland to get away from the flood and all the other refugees, and there's panic and there's chaos and people are murdered and crushed and there's civil unrest, but all of it is slightly off because her main thing is this baby that she's given birth to, and watching the baby grow older and watching the baby's development. And so even though it's been described as a dystopian book, it isn't really. It's a book about hope and about newness and about how every new life is a new start. And it's actually really, really sweet and really, really lovely. The very end of the book, the baby walks its first steps. And the idea is it's the first steps of humanity after this huge cataclysm. It's probably the cheeriest The World Gets Destroyed, well, Britain, London Gets Destroyed book you've ever read. And finally, in July, was The Card, which is all about a man called Demry in the sort of 1900s, 1910s. And he forges his way onto a scholarship, and then he forges his way into a ball. And when he's at the ball, he takes a chance and he dances with the Countess, and with that he gets a name for himself in the town as a card, a character, someone who's a bit interesting. And throughout his life he uses this reputation and he builds it to get away with things, really. He always gets away with anything he goes for. So he decides to become a rent collector, and as he's collecting rents, there are people who can't pay it, so he loans them the money to pay the rent and gets interest, so he gets extra money, but they get to stay in their house as well. And what I was expecting this book to do was to say how this kind of amoral, entrepreneurial, ducking and diving kind of character had really dark undertones underneath the exterior of the card. But it didn't do that, because everything he does actually has a net positive. So every selfish act he has a sort of benefit to the society he's in. So it's a very fun, silly book about this person who takes these chances and gets away with it and actually makes life better, which made it a much more fun book than the book I thought it would be, but maybe not as deep or as questioning as it could have been. This book loves language. There's a chapter called the Pantechnicon, which is a very large van. And the word Pantechnicon comes into this chapter so many times. In fact, about 4 times it says, well, Pantechnicon is as a Pantechnicon does. I think that is a moral which we could all live by if we knew what it meant. Also, this was published in 1911, and some characters go on the White Star Line ship Tubtanic. The Tubtanic survives its maiden voyage, unlike the Titanic. So yeah, it was enjoyable. It was a nice bit of fluff, and it was a very nice way to end the month. So that was what I read this month. I guess I'll do another one in September for August. Thank you very much. July.